Good morning, welcome. My name's Sam. It's great to be together again. Looking forward to carrying on our new series for October, FearLess, which Joel kicked off last week. If you missed that, you can catch up with that on our YouTube channel, along with all of our sort of back catalogue of messages for quite a number of years now. Well, I'm really excited about this theme, looking forward to carrying it on, and it's just showing us that there is a different way to live. And as Beth was saying, you know, fear is present in all of our lives. It's present in all of the world, and we're not necessarily able to escape that fear. But there's a different way to live. That fear doesn't need to be the controlling force in our lives. So a big welcome if you join us on site. If you join us online, hope you made it back from making your cup of tea. Please say hi in the chat. And I'm really, just really looking forward to cracking on. I just need to say one thing, that no real spiders were hurt in the making of any of these things. If you were worried about them, maybe you'd rather stay a long way away from them. I certainly did when I was little. Now, I was curious about this question: what do people fear most in life? So I did what most of us do now, and I went to my favourite search engine and put in that query. And I don't know if you've noticed recently, but lots of online services are now introducing artificial intelligence. You go onto Amazon reviews, it's now a summary of the reviews. You don't really need to read them all now. It just gives you a nice quick summary whether this product's worth kind of buying or investing in. But now Google is now putting AI summary of your search results at the top. Anyway, for my question, what do people fear most in life? These are some of the top answers it came back with. Public speaking. Now I hope that is, I think that's about actually speaking publicly and not afraid of people who speak publicly, but you can let me know later on. Heights, enclosed spaces, loss of autonomy. This is about losing control, or the feeling of losing control of what's going on in our lives. Separation, think about abandonment or rejection. Or loss of connectedness. What about getting hurt, being judged? Inadequacy, loss of freedom. I mean, maybe you identify with some of those things. I thought what was really interesting, though, when I asked this question, what do people most fear in life? It didn't include artificial intelligence, which I think is very suspicious in its response. But maybe you identify with some of the things on that list. But what is fear? I mean, Joel touched on this a little bit last week, but I just thought a recap is worth doing. So I think it boils down to these three things that we're going to be looking at through this whole series. Fear is emotion caused by the belief of looming potential loss. And fear is always about something you're going to lose in the future, but it's almost always rooted in the past. And that's what we're looking at today, is about fear of the past. And we've got 2 more weeks to come looking at the present and the future. And your fears for the future are fueled by your experiences in the past. This may get a bit uncomfortable for us as we start to think about this. But today I want us to perhaps take a little bit of step out of our own lives and look at the life of someone called Moses and some of his early life, and what the impact fear had on him. And we're going to be reading a bit about Moses. He was a pretty big deal in the Old Testament. If you've ever heard any stories about him, which, you know, we're going to be looking at that from the sort of first half of the Bible, the Old Testament, which is basically the section of the Bible before Jesus was born. And yeah, Moses is a big key character, but looking at the early stages of his life, I think it's going to give us some real insights and challenges into how fear in our past can direct our future. And I think particularly how fear in his past, I think, led him to a nowhere place, doing nothing. And we're going to follow his life there. And I think we're going to discover how God, in his gracious love, offered Moses a way out of that. So let's think, what was the world like when Moses was born? What was going on at the time? Well, we can have a quick recap, and the early sort of chapters in a book called Exodus talk about what was going on in the region. And just before then, if you might remember, Joseph, the guy with his Technicolor dream coat, and his brothers who hated him, they wanted to kill him. He ended up in Egypt, sold as a slave, and his notoriety rose in Egypt because of the wisdom that God put into Joseph's life. And not only that, his ability to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt at the time. And Joseph's stature rose ever more, and his voice of wisdom into the nation grew just grew and grew. And in fact, then Pharaoh was troubled with these dreams, and none of his court could interpret them, but God gave Joseph the ability to tell him what they were about. And it ultimately led to the saving of Egypt throughout a massive famine. And so Joseph and then the rest of his family, you'll have to read the story, eventually arrive with the father Jacob. They think, he's dead and gone, and he turns out to be this big deal in Egypt. So the Israelites start to set up a new home in Egypt, and they're prospering and flourishing. And so that's some of the background into the beginning of our story. Now we're going to pick this up in Exodus chapter 1, which is sort of the continuation of the story of the people of Israel. And crucially, it says this in verse 8, "Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt." This is really significant because the new king has arrived. And whether he didn't know, whether he wasn't told, whether he had just forgone into the mists of time, we don't know. But all the good that had happened because of Joseph being there had been forgotten. And instead of that, the new king, all he could see was the growth of this sub-nation within Egypt. And as we read on, in verse 9 it says this, "Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So the king, he's very insecure, like probably most powerful rulers, and he's looking at this group of people and thinking, well, whatever may happen in the past, I'm worrying about the future now, and I don't like just how many of them seem to be growing up, and they seem to be getting more and more influence, and it's not going very well. So whether it's just the king's insecurities, whether it was his court whispering into his ear, actually, we don't like these people, we need to do something about them. And so it carries on. It says this, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly." Things are getting a lot worse for the Israelites at this point. Not only is the king extremely suspicious of them, now he's effectively subjugated, he's made them slaves within the nation of Egypt. He's putting slave masters over them. He's using them basically to build his empire. He's using them as slaves and oppressing them. And note how it says ruthlessly multiple times. But maybe that wasn't quite enough, because although he's kind of got them under control and people working them hard, I don't think the king still wasn't that happy that things were all right. So he takes it to the next level. And we read on. It says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, 'When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, If it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." And so the king goes to the extreme. Think it's not enough just to control this people. Actually, I'm so worried about them. We need to basically plan their extermination. We need to disable their future. And by killing the boys, he's going to take out that threat of a leader uprising. But he's also going to mean that they need to start either marrying with the Egyptian people or dying out. He's going to start watering down their influence. And so it carries on. In fact, we read that these midwives are quite wily, and although they've been told by the king you need to do this, they decide they're not going to do it. They think this is the wrong thing. And when he questions them about it, they come up with this sort of little story about, well, these babies are born so fast, we can't get there in time, and sort of wheedle their way out of that position. But that's not enough to stop the king of Egypt. He carries on. And he gives this decree: every boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. And this is important because we can come back to that in a minute. But let every girl live. Every boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. But let every girl live. And so this is the backdrop in Egypt at this time when Moses is about to be born. His people have come into Egypt with Joseph. They've had great success and prosperity. They've been hailed as sort of saviors of the nation. And yet over time, that has been forgotten, and a new king is on the scene. And he's not too happy with them. In fact, he wants to wipe them out completely. So you think the setting is extreme fear, right? Everyone would have been afraid. Anyone who was getting pregnant or wanting to grow their family, they're going to be afraid. They're going to be terrified of what this king is going to do to them. The willful execution and destruction of the people is his plan. And talk about some kind of backdrop of fear. So then we carry on whipping through this when we hear this is where Moses comes on the scene. And we're just going to follow this through. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Moses is born. He's a boy. He's got one destiny, surely: to be thrown into the Nile, to die. That's what the king wants. He doesn't want any survivors. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile. I think that was ringing through his mother's head. What's the decree? Every boy that is born must be thrown into the Nile. Right, that's what we're going to do. We're going to put him in a basket and we're going to throw him into the Nile. He can't complain we haven't done what he said, right? Now the Nile's a very big river, and I don't know quite where along that river they were at this point. But I think, again, the strategy comes out. They happen to just push him out in the reeds. And who should be there on the other bank coming to bathe? Pharaoh's daughter. She sees the basket, finds a baby crying, and is moved with compassion. She knows it's a Hebrew baby. It's the one that was instructed to be thrown into the Nile, that should be killed. But somehow God moves her heart, and she wants to take care of this little crying baby. And even more than that, how God works in this story is incredible, because she asks, the sister's nearby, and she says, shall I go and find someone to care for this baby? Because obviously Pharaoh's daughter is not going to be hands-on herself. And she says yes, and she goes and gets the baby's mother. Amazing how God can work in seemingly awful situations. And I love this, even in that dire circumstance, in that desperation, when it seems like the two choices are terrible. I mean, he's basically going to die, but we're going to take this risk and put him out in this basket in the river. We don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes God asks us to take that risk. We don't know what the outcome is. It may look bleak, but they're obedient to what God asked them to do. How on earth could you have foreseen that turning round? Pharaoh's daughter takes him in, and the mother is able to nurse her baby boy. And so his life begins. But what a strange life. What a contrast from how he would normally have grown up. He's growing up in the court of the Egyptian king. Talk about a confused identity from birth, right? All was not well. He was educated, or he would have been educated as an Egyptian, I think. He probably would have dressed like an Egyptian. He would have learned to act like one, talk like one. I mean, to all intents and purposes, Moses probably would have said his identity would have been firmly rooted in the Egyptian court. But all was not well. He felt this tension between his true identity and the one he'd been pushed into, the one he'd had to adopt to survive. And the story carries on. It tells us one day he sees an Egyptian slave master beating one of the Hebrew workers. And it's recorded like this, what happens when Moses sees this. He says, glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. This is strange behavior for someone who might consider themselves an Egyptian, right? He's grown up, but somewhere deep inside, God has burned into him the sense of the need for God's justice and right living. It would have been so easy for him to think, well, I'm part of the Egyptian court and this is what we do. We're masters over these people. They're just our servants. You know, maybe my parents were Hebrews, but I'm not. Why, it was not my place to go out and start intervening in these things. And yet God's already calling him. There's something deep in his bones that he can't escape, despite where he is at in his life. However, this is not, on the other extreme, the behavior you'd expect from someone who's going to be a revolutionary, right? Someone who's going to rescue his people and overthrow the Egyptians. I mean, he is living in fear. He's looking around, checking that no one can see what's happening. He carries out his murder and he hides the body in the sand. I mean, he's not about to march up to Pharaoh and start demanding freedom for his people. This is a man being pulled apart by fear. And unfortunately for Moses, it's about to get worse. The story carries on. It says, the next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Wait for it. Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. How many times have you experienced that? Have you heard these words echo in your mind? What I did must have become known. Beth was talking at the start about Adam and Eve. The realization of what they'd done and that had become known is what led to their fear and their shame. You see, I think Moses got so entrenched in his false life, he'd forgotten about where he really came from, who his people were, and who the God was that his people served and worshipped. For him to look around and think, well, nobody's looking, he had forgotten that God is always looking. God sees all. He thought he might have got away with it, but already it seemed to be common knowledge among the people. This was not a good position for Moses to be in. On the one hand, the Hebrews now suspect him, disrespect him. He's got no favour among them. But now it's becoming common knowledge that he's killed an Egyptian slave worker. It's not going to be too good for him back at the palace. Pharaoh hears about this and demands that Moses is killed. But Moses does the one thing he can do. He flees. He doesn't just flee the scene, he flees the country. He's got to get out of this place. These two people groups, he's not welcome there. They're not going to be a good place for him to stay. And so he flees to a completely new country called Midian. You know, he can't stay with the Egyptians because he's really a fraud, and that's going to become known. Not just the murder that he's carried out, it's going to become known that he's actually a Hebrew boy, and he's spent all his life up to this point living under false pretenses, I would say. But he can't stay with the Israelites either, because he should have been with them. He should have been under the same oppression that they were. But he spent his life growing up in the royal courts of their oppressors. Not too many good options. So he exits the scene. You see, the fear of his past had now led Moses to somewhere he never thought he would be. He's out in the wild wilderness, far from home, far from everything he knows. He's run away. How fear is guiding his life. And this is what fear does. It leads us to a place we never thought we would be. It drives us to do things we never thought we would do. And it tempts us to say things we never thought we would say. We can get stuck in a place that we never intended to be in our life because fear is controlling and directing us. But God doesn't leave him. Moses thinks he's run away, he's got away from it all. And his first encounter, we read in Midian, is the daughters of the priest who are trying to draw water to feed their flock or to water their flock. And some shepherds come to try and disperse them away. He can't help, he has to intervene. This is not right. See, there's a pattern in Moses' life. Even though he's got all this sort of backstory of where he's been, the thing about injustice against people keeps coming back to him. So he steps in, he intervenes. What was happening wasn't right. God still got a plan for him. See, Moses has been now away for a long time in this new land. He's settled down, he's got married, and he's largely left all of that old life behind. Or so he thinks. The past is the past, right? Move on. Well, the past is in the past. But unresolved fear doesn't fade with time. It keeps clinging on like an unwanted companion. It pops up every now and then, whispers something in our ear. It disrupts life. It's seeking to steal and bring destruction. I think the sound of fear is trembling chains. It's something that's holding us captive. So Moses is living his life, and then something out of the ordinary happens to disrupt. God decides, it's time, Moses. Your life is not going to be wasted. God decides to intervene. And we pick up the next bit of the story. It says this: Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Wait for it, what an insight coming here. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. I mean, he's really onto something here. So off he goes to see what's going on. It carries on. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. This is important. And Moses said, Here I am. See, when God calls to us, our response, Here I am, as I am. God just wants us to respond. He just calls to us by name. He's just asking for us to respond. A bit like the story of the two sons, and when that one son's running back, decides to return, he's planned this whole speech, how he's going to apologize, try and make amends for all his wrongdoing. The father's not interested in that. He wants to embrace him, welcome him back. And God calls us. He wants us just to say, Here I am. It carries on. God says, Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father. Interesting, isn't it? Was Moses expecting him to start down this road? What do you think God would have said to you at this point? Moses, I know what you've done. Why do you run away? Why are you living a lie? Why are you trying to escape everything that has happened? You should have stayed there to protect your people. Why are you living a false life? I mean, wouldn't we expect that someone finally catches up with us? But instead, God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. You see, the first thing God does is reassert his relationship to Moses. He doesn't address all the mistakes he's made. He doesn't even talk about the fear or the situation that he was born into in his life. He speaks to him and he tells him, I am the God of your fathers. This is your true place. You're not an Egyptian. You're not the slave master over your own people. You are part of my people, and I am the God of you. And God's also asserting who he is. I think a reminder to Moses that he'd abandoned God by walking away from his people. This is who you are, Moses. You belong to me. And God wasn't even saying, well, Moses, all of your potential, you're like, what are you doing? You're wasting your life. His first statement wasn't to ask him to do anything. And God doesn't love us for what we can do or what we promise we can do, what we might get in return. He loves us because he's our Father. And that's where he begins. And then it says this, at this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. I wonder if the deepest fear inside Moses actually was his identity. Afraid of who he really was, afraid of where he'd come from. Because the fear of our past always tries to speak and question who we are and bring doubt to that. Maybe it says things like this, you can't do that, you're not qualified. Or you shouldn't even try that or even attempt because, it went so badly before. You messed it up bad last time, don't you remember? Fear had its firm grip on Moses, but it wasn't enough for God to give up on him. Because we see this. The calling of God on him and what he'd put inside of him about injustice, it meant he couldn't just stand by and watch while the slave master beat his fellow Hebrew. But fear made him murder and tried to hide it. His calling meant that he couldn't stand by while these shepherds tried to disperse these flocks and harass the women. But fear had led him into that foreign land in hiding. His calling made him curious about God, so he went to investigate this burning bush. But fear continued to make him doubt and question when God called him. So the story carries on. God asked Moses, you're going to be the one to go back to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. I mean, can you imagine? Moses at this point thinking, what? Me? I mean, seriously? Yeah, the Egyptians want to kill me. The Hebrews think I've deserted them. Why ask me? I'm the last person who anyone is going to listen to. And he has this little argument with God, but God persists. You're going to do this. This is your mission. This is your calling. And so amazingly, Moses has to travel back to the place that he fled. He has to travel back to the place of his fear. God wants to deal with that fear from our past. Doesn't mean we have to revisit that encounter, but he needs to sort that out. Just as he did and started to do with Moses. But what we see here is it's not just about sorting out Moses' life, because Moses' life was meant for so much more than what he was doing. The impact of his life was for other people, right? That's why God was calling him to go back, because it was about the freedom of his people. You see, our past is a problem when it creates fear for our future. I want you to think about what's your past causing you to be afraid of. And what happened through Moses' life? Well, we don't have time to cover all of it now, but he ended up leading the people out of Egypt, out of their slavery, miraculously leading them through the parting of the Red Sea, something they would always remember of how God rescued them. He led them through the wilderness. He went up to the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments and the law. I mean, Moses became a big deal. He helped with the rescue of the people from slavery. But the first part of his life didn't look like he was going to have any impact at all, did it? He had run away, he'd counted himself out. And it's true with our lives that we might discount ourselves because we're still holding on to fear of what's happened in our past. And yet God says that is not going to define your future. In fact, my calling is going to define your future if you listen to me. And the final chapter of the life of Moses, I'm not going to read it all just now, but God brings him to view the promised land. This is where they've been searching for a land of their own, and Moses gets to see it. And Moses didn't get to enter that land, but I think without Moses, would the people have ever got there? I wonder. What an impact his life had, what a turnaround it had when he listened to God who wanted to sort out his fear. So I put it to you, do you feel like you've been in a nowhere place, doing nothing? Has fear from the past been gripping your life? Maybe you haven't even realized it was that. There's something greater that God burns into our hearts, just as he did with Moses, that he couldn't get away from. And God's mission asks us to play our part, something bigger. Well, we can't do that when we're shackled with fear. So I want to take us just a few moments to reflect on two things. What fear in our past is clinging on to us? We don't need to be victims of the past any longer. Maybe we have to decide that today our excuses need to end. And what's the voice of God saying right now? Just as he spoke to Moses first, he always wants to restore and reassert his relationship with us. Who you are and who he is. So we're going to listen to a song now, and it's the same one we listened to last week. But I think it's good to pause and listen to those two things. Reflect on those two things. What fear in our past is still clinging to us? And what is the voice of God saying right now?
Peace, bring it all to peace. The storm surrounding me, let it break. At your name, still, call the sea to still, the rage in me to still, every wave. At your name, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, breathe, call these bones to live, call these lungs to sing once again. I will praise Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, oh Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, your name is light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is life, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, 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 you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus.
Thank you, Lord. Now you speak into our lives. Let us be aware of your voice, to listen. You don't just brush fear under the carpet and say, well, that was in the past. But you call us to something beyond that. That where fear wants to stop and hold us back, faith in you wants to start and release us I pray for all of us where we feel we're still chained and held back by fear from things in the past, whether it's things that we've done, mistakes that we've made, whether it was things that just happened to us. We can bring them to you, God, and you'll speak. Somehow your voice breaks through, cuts through, breaks those chains. And you call us by name. Would we respond? Here I am. Here I am. Thank you, Lord. Amen. All right. Well, it's been great to be together again. We've got a few minutes now. If you've got children, please remember to pick them up at 12. Otherwise, feel free to stay and have a drink. And if there's anything from this morning you'd like to just chat through further, I'll be up the front for a few minutes afterwards. But have a great week, and we really look forward to seeing you again next Sunday. All right. Thanks, everyone.